While taxiing before takeoff, notice on the FMA that the climb mode is blue, meaning that it is armed, and it will engage automatically during takeoff as SRS Speed Reference System. There is no lateral mode showing, meaning that runway track is active. Runway track is selected by turning the heading knob at least one click in either direction. The knob must not be pulled or pushed. Runway track can be used up to 400 feet AGL to ensure obstacle clearance during initial climb should an engine failure occur. 1 FD2 indicates that both flight directors are on, even though no flight director symbols are displayed on the ground. Also notice the box corners toward the edges of the ADI and the Maltese cross in the center. These symbols appear after engine start and are used during the flight control check. The cross is the side stick command indicator, what the stick is commanding in pitch or roll. The box corners are stick command limits. The center of the cross should not exceed these limits when performing the flight control check. The ground roll guidance command bar also appears after engine start, when either toga or flex is selected, and provided there is an operating localizer on the takeoff runway selected in the MCDU. It replaces the FD vertical bar and is used during takeoff and rollout for assistance during low visibility. All of these symbols disappear after takeoff. When the thrust levers are placed into the flex or toga detent, the FMAs indicate manual flex 49, meaning that the thrust has been manually placed into the flex detent, and that thrust for the assumed temperature of 49 degrees Celsius has been calculated and set. Speed select 197 in blue, meaning that a speed other than the default econ speed has been selected. A/THR illuminates in blue, meaning that the auto thrust system is automatically armed. It will engage automatically when thrust is reduced to climb. The FMA also shows SRS as the vertical engaged mode. SRS, Speed Reference System, commands the horizontal flight director bar to a pitch angle resulting in a speed of V2 plus 10 knots. Should an engine fail, SRS will command a speed of V2 or existing aircraft speed, whichever is higher. RWI, meaning runway track, is the engaged lateral mode. Runway track is selected by simply turning the heading knob one click in either direction while the aircraft is on the ground. The heading knob must not be pushed or pulled. Runway track can be used up to 400 feet AGL to ensure obstacle clearance during initial climb in case of engine failure. At 30 feet, runway turns to runway track. This mode provides lateral guidance on the extended runway center line based on the track memorized during the takeoff roll. The autopilot may be turned on at 100 feet AGL, provided SRS has engaged. If it has not, the autopilot may not be used until 500 feet AGL. At 400 feet AGL, the aircraft must be put into the heading mode. This is accomplished by pulling the heading knob on the flight control unit. At the UAL thrust reduction acceleration altitude of 800 feet AGL, a white flashing message, lever climb, appears in the auto thrust FMA. The FMA flashes as a reminder to set the thrust levers to the climb detent. Set the thrust levers to climb. Thrust climb illuminates in green in the auto thrust FMA column, and auto thrust turns white in the engaged status column. The auto throttles have automatically engaged. The system is in the thrust mode and commands max climb thrust. Also at 800 feet, SRS has disengaged and the vertical mode now becomes open climb. Since we had changed the econ climb speed to green dot, the FMGC treats this speed as a selected speed. The magenta triangle indicating managed speed disappears and is replaced by the blue selected speed indications. Since 197 knots is off the speed scale, a blue number appears on top of the speed tape. Also, ALT is displayed in blue, indicating that the altitude capture mode is armed. The aircraft now begins to accelerate to green dot speed. 60% of the power is used to increase speed and 40% to maintain climb. Flaps and slats are retracted on schedule. Note, the selected speed number has disappeared and has been replaced by the blue triangle. At 3,000 feet AGL, the aircraft is returned to the managed speed mode by pushing in on the speed knob. Push in on the speed knob. The aircraft is now in the managed speed mode. Managed speed indications appear on the speed tape. Since 250 knots is above the speed tape range, the indication is shown by a magenta number above the speed tape. Also note that the flight control unit speed window has closed, the numbers being replaced with dashes, and the managed speed light is on. The following illustration, while not yet part of United's operating procedure, is an illustration of the capabilities of the A320. While there are plans to incorporate procedures like these into the manual, at the present time the most restrictive altitude must always be set on the flight control unit. The flight plan contains a SID, which was loaded into the FMGC during initial setup. The SID has an altitude restriction of 8,000 feet, as indicated by the magenta dot on the MCDU. Pressing the constraint button on the EFIS control panel will display the restriction on the ND, whether it be a speed, altitude, or time restriction. Press the cstr constraint button. The constraint button illuminates green, and the altitude constraint of 8,000 feet, which already is shown on the MCDU, is now visible on the ND. We are airborne and level at 4,000 feet. ATC clears us to flight level 230, with the restriction to cross the intersection at or below 8,000 feet. First, we dial in the cleared altitude of flight level 230. Then we command a VNAV climb by pushing in on the altitude knob. Note, the level change light illuminates, indicating that the FMGC is in vertical nav, or VNAV. On the PFD, the primary indication that VNAV is engaged is climb, CLB, enunciated in green in the vertical column. The FMGS has predicted that it will reach the VNAV constraint altitude of 8,000 feet before reaching the intersection. This is indicated by the magenta level point arrow. On the PFD, the ALT in magenta on the FMA, and the target altitude 8,000 in magenta on the altitude scale indicate that the FMGC will level off and capture this restrictive altitude constraint. The aircraft is now approaching the altitude constraint. The altitude constraint mode automatically engages as indicated by the FMA. On the altimeter, the magenta target altitude indicator is moving downward. The aircraft is now level at the constraint altitude, with altitude constraint in green on the FMA. VNAV is still armed, as shown by the blue climb on the FMA. It will automatically re-engage when the aircraft flies over the constraint waypoint. The re-engagement point is marked by the blue start of climb arrow on the ND. You now receive a clearance to cross Narren intersection at flight level 230. Then climb to and maintain flight level 350. After entering the constraint into the FMGC, the system predicts reaching flight level 230 before crossing the waypoint, as indicated by the magenta level arrow. The system automatically reverts to the thrust climb mode, and the new constraint becomes the target, ALT and 23,000 in magenta. ATC now clears you to maintain a heading of 200. Pull the heading knob to engage the heading mode. On the FMAs, climb is replaced by open climb, and the magenta altitude has been replaced by blue altitude in the vertical column, and heading has replaced nav in the lateral column. On the ND, the solid green line now indicates the aircraft track line, and the dotted green line is now the FMGS flight plan. On the FCU, the LAT indicator light extinguishes, the window opens, dashes disappear, and the present aircraft heading appears in the window. When the heading mode was engaged, VNAV automatically disengaged and the FMGC automatically reverted to open climb mode. ALT magenta reverted to ALT blue, and the magenta 23,000 changed to blue 35,000. Altitude capture is now armed to the FCU set altitude, not the lower constraint altitude. When not on the assigned route, the altitude constraints which are assigned to flight plan waypoints must be disregarded. The cardinal rule to remember is LNAV must be engaged for VNAV to operate. You have now been cleared to a heading of 180 to intercept course and resume normal navigation. Since the intercept point is on this side of the 2 waypoint, the aircraft will smoothly intercept. Rearm LNAV. NAV is now armed on the lateral FMA, blue. On the FCU, a white dot in the heading window indicates that Managed Nav is armed. On the ND, the solid green line indicates the track line to the computed intercept point, and then the remainder of the flight plan. If the intercept statement is missing, then the track line is crossing the flight plan beyond the 2 waypoint, and interception is not possible without further action. When the aircraft closes with the intercept point, the nav mode automatically engages, as seen by the indications on the FCU and on the FMA. VNAV is available again, but since there are no more constraints, it is not necessary to re-engage it. Climb and open climb will now perform the same function. Passing through the transition altitude, a yellow flashing STD message appears below the altimeter. The FMGC does not know 29.92 as anything but a QNH barometric setting. Therefore, the barometric set knob on the EFIS control panel must be pulled to set standard, STD. Pull the baro set knob. The symbol STD now displaces the baro setting. The altitude annunciation on top of the altimeter is changed to a flight level reading. Lastly, the window in the EFIS control panel now reads STD. You are re-cleared to flight level 290, and now ATC advises that 290 is your final. Since it cannot take radio calls, the FMGS assumes that you will continue the climb to flight level 350 and is therefore still in the climb phase, as shown on the MCDU performance page. You have to change the cruise level on the MCDU progress page. Select the progress page. Changing the cruise flight on this page will allow the system to go into the cruise phase. The cruise Mach will be adjusted to its optimum value, which will maximize fuel consumption. The new flight level is already typed into the scratch pad. Insert the new flight level. The vertical mode has changed to altitude cruise, and the MCDU page has changed to cruise, indicating that the Autoflight system is now in cruise mode. The aircraft has now reached the point of descent. ATC has cleared you to flight level 270. Since it is a 2,000-foot step down, you decide to descend slowly, selecting minus 1,500 feet per minute on the FCU vertical speed and pulling the knob. Auto thrust is in speed or Mach mode. The autopilot is controlled by a selected vertical speed. In this instance, the selected vertical speed has priority over the auto thrust speed mode. This means that if too high a vertical speed is selected, the autopilot will pitch the aircraft down to track the vertical speed target. Even though the autothrust will command idle, the airspeed can increase significantly, even into the overspeed range. You have been cleared to 10,000 feet. Disregarding the econ descent, you have selected 10,000 on the FCU and pulled the altitude selector. Thrust idle indicates that the FMGC will maintain the thrust at idle throughout the descent. The autopilot flight director is in open descent mode. This means that the autopilot commands the pitch so as to maintain the target speed of 280 knots all the way down to the FCU selected altitude of 10,000 feet. As the aircraft reaches the target altitude, the speed mode automatically engages on auto thrust. Alt-star automatically engages in the vertical mode. Alt-star is the capturing mode, smoothly rounding out the level off. As soon as the aircraft is level, Alt-altitude will engage. We have descended to 2,000 feet and are still in the nav mode with managed speed engaged. To prepare for the approach, we need to put the system into the approach phase of flight. This is accomplished by selecting the performance key on the MCDU. It automatically displays the active phase of flight, descent. Note, the prompt at line select key 6 left, activate approach phase. Activation gives us automatic speed control if speed is in the managed mode, green dot if clean, S speed if flaps 1, F speed if flaps 2 or 3, and V approach if flaps are full. If you are still some distance from the airport and wish to activate, the use of selected speed is recommended to prevent being 40 miles out at green dot. Note the deceleration point on the ND. The aircraft should already be in the approach phase and should have been slowed and configured for the airport traffic pattern. If it is not, activation will automatically occur when crossing the deceleration point below 7,200 feet AGL in a managed nav mode. If the aircraft overflies the deceleration point with managed speed engaged, the aircraft will automatically begin slowing to a speed appropriate to the aircraft configuration. Even if you are in selected speed, the approach phase will automatically activate. However, the aircraft will not slow, since a selected speed will override a managed speed. You are flying an intercept course toward the ILS and have been cleared for the approach. Display the ILS raw data. The ILS switch illuminates green and the raw data ILS scales are displayed on the PFD. On the FMA, a decision height of 200 feet has previously been inserted into the MCDU performance page. Now press the approach button to arm the approach modes, localizer and glide slope. Press the approach button. The approach button illuminates green. On the FMA, the localizer and glide slope are armed, blue. When you press the approach button, the localizer glide slope modes become active because you have inserted an ILS approach into the flight plan. To accomplish an auto-land, at least one autopilot must be engaged. For complete redundancy, the second autopilot should be engaged. Auto-land requirements will be discussed later in your training. Engage Autopilot 2. Both Autopilot 1 and Autopilot 2 are now on, and the approach capability is Cat 3 Dual. This ensures the highest possible redundancy level, and thus the lowest possible approach minima. The aircraft is now at green dot. Once the aircraft is 10 knots below VFE next, the amber dashes at 230 knots, the flaps can be selected to 1, and the aircraft will decelerate toward S speed. On the PFD, you can notice that the loc deviation symbol is centered, meaning that the aircraft is established on the localizer. Loc capture is indicated in green on the FMA. At S speed, flaps were extended to 2, and the aircraft began slowing to F speed. Since the glide slope has broken case, we will extend flaps to 3. The glide slope was captured at 2,000 feet with flaps 3 extended. We have successfully set the gear down, flaps full, go-around altitude on the FCU, 2,500 feet. During the approach, as the aircraft crosses 700 feet radio altitude, ILS tuning is frozen. At this point, an FMGS change or failure does not affect the approach completion. At about 400 feet RA, the land mode engages, and any action on the FCU is disregarded. Land can be disengaged only by landing or by engaging the go-around mode. At around 50 feet, the flare mode automatically engages. At around 30 feet, the autothrottle reduces the thrust to idle. At around 10 feet, a retard auto callout reminds you to set the thrust levers to idle. At touchdown, the rollout mode automatically engages, and the ground roll command guidance bar is displayed on the PFD. The autopilot tracks the runway centerline using the localizer signal. Use reverse thrust and brakes as required. Switch autopilot off at low speed.